So let's jump right into introductions, and I'll ask each of our speakers to briefly introduce themselves, and that would include a brief history of their career in pharmacy. Brief. I know you all have a lot to share in different ways. We'll have a chance to get into that throughout the session. And tell us a little bit about your business and the work that you're doing now as well, and how that work had begun. So we'll just go in order. Brooke, if you want to kick us off, and then Jimmy, Kelley, and Natalie take it from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Welcome to everyone here. Welcome to my esteemed panelists. I'm so excited to be here and learn from them as well. I'm Brooke Griffin. I'm a pharmacist, professor of pharmacy practice at Midwestern University, and a professional coach in life and work. So at the university, I'm a vice chair in the Department of Pharmacy Practice. And really what that means is that I help the department chair with operations and strategy and really serve as a liaison between the faculty members and their clinical sites. I'm also heavily involved in our professional development program for our students. My business is Bold Idea Group, and that's coaching, consulting, speaking. And what I do is I help mid-career pharmacists answer the question, what's next for me? And I'm excited to dig into that a little bit more.
Thank you, Brooke. Jimmy?
Hey guys, I'm Jim Pruitt. I'm a EM clinical pharmacist by training, and I am currently a RPD and pharmacist at Carolina Medical Center here in lovely Charlotte, North Carolina. My company, again, I have a few here, but all of them are emergency medicine, acute care based education from the conference to our academy and then our podcast network. And excited to meet with you all and talk and learn from the rest of the panelists here.
Hello, all. I'm Kelley Carlstrom. So great to be here. I've been on some other webinars with Tim and the YFP folks, so it's going to be a great discussion. I am an oncology pharmacist by background, so was in clinical practice for many years and fell into some non-traditional roles, including starting my own business, which was never on my professional bingo card. It just happened. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more about that, but I run training programs. So I help pharmacists learn oncology, this crazy world of oncology that we live in. I trained in it over a decade ago, and it has exploded even more since then. It's becoming incredibly complex and challenging, but it's also the most rewarding part of pharmacy, I think. I think it's the best specialty. Jimmy might push back on me about emergency medicine, but there's a lot of jobs in oncology.
Natalie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie, co-founder and CEO of Pharmesol. So at Pharmesol, we develop conversational AI pharmacy assistant that automates phone calls, messaging, as well as associated workflows, specifically for pharmacy teams, because what I've seen is that pharmacy teams need more capacity to do work. So previously, I worked at a health system implementing a lot of medication management solutions. That's what inspired me to start Pharmesol. Before that, I actually started my career doing health economics and outcomes research in pharma. Great to be here.
Very cool. Thank you to all of you. And one of the things I like that's consistent across these four individuals is that all of them have found a way to monetize their area of expertise, passion, and interest that I think is a really cool example that many pharmacists can draw from that, might start in a traditional W-2 job. And as we'll talk about here in a moment, sometimes it's building something while you're also working full time. And sometimes it's a jump, right? And it's an evolution. For me in my own journey, building YFP, that was a 6-year period of building YFP while working full time in an academic environment. And I think that time span can often provide a space where you can somewhat safely explore areas of interest, passions, and see what the market has to say, right, about the idea and the interest that's out there and what you're building. And I want to actually start there. And I didn't plan this question, so I'm already going off script for the time that we have today. But as I look at our four panelists, as you were introducing yourselves, Brooke and Jimmy, both of you have made an intentional decision to stay in your work that you're doing full time, and you're building your entrepreneurial efforts, your business on the side while you're working full time, which has upside and has challenges, knowing that from full experience. And Kelley and Natalie, both of you have made the transition into full-time entrepreneurship, which has upside and has challenges to that approach as well. So I would like to hear from each one of you why you have made that decision at the phase that you're in right now and how you have gone through that thought process, because it's one of those common questions I get. right? Like, Tim, I've got this idea. I'm building something. It's generating some revenue. And I just don't know. Should I go all in or should I keep kind of building this on the side? So, Brooke, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So great question. It's a question I get a lot as well. There are many things I love about my quote day job. It fills my cup in so many ways. It adds value to my life. I feel like I'm adding value to it. And, I don't know where this business will go. So the question of leaving my day job hasn't really come into my mind at all. I like balancing both. I like having both. I like how one feeds the other in multiple ways. And for me, whenever I do kind of entertain that question, in my mind, if it's still a question mark, the answer is no.
Mm.
I want it to feel like a full body yes, and I'm not there yet. And I think there's still so many things I love about my day job.
Jimmy, how about for you? I mean, it sounds like you've got all the time in the world, right? It's not like you're working full time, young family, running a residency program. So how have you made this decision, especially when you're in a space where your day job is directly related to the work that you're doing in the business? And so I would suspect that maybe detaching from that uh, might free you up to have some more time to work in the business, but also maybe is a step away then from the clinical practice that's informing what you're doing in the business.
That's completely accurate. One of the things I look at is, like all of us, we have a passion for what we're doing. And for me, being able to understand what's happening at the bedside, really be in tune with the needs and the trends of what's going on right now, that's what really has influenced me. But I think when I take a seat back and I think about all of the work that goes into building the business, there's always that thought like, hey, how much longer can I do that? And what I've done is I set a number and a consistency of monthly revenue that I need to get to before I can start having that conversation more realistically. And with me having a family, having young children, and really having a lot of influence of learners with the residency program and the things that I do within the podcasting space, I really want to make sure I was making a educated decision and a decision that's based off of numbers and not how I felt. And I think that's where I am right now. And we can see the trends. And of course, there's going to be numbers that we look at and say, hey, if I can reach this number for 6 months straight and I have a certain amount of assurance from a emergency fund standpoint, then we can start having a lot more of those conversations. And it looks great for the future, but I want to make sure I'm hitting those numbers more consistently while also getting the data and kind of having my finger on the pulse of the industry.
Jimmy, I love that because it can be a chicken and the egg thing, right? In terms of, if you're able to go full time in the business, you've got more time, energy, and effort. And we know it can happen when we have a laser focus on what we're working on. But it also could be a financial stress to the individual and the business potentially, depending, wherever the stage of the business is at. And so I think that balance point is a hard one to navigate. But I like what you're sharing about the objectivity of how you're thinking about that. Kelley, what about for you? You went in the deep end. You said, I'm all in, I'm betting in myself. So how did you get to that point decision making? You went through a couple years of advanced clinical training, worked at a large academic medical center or two along the way, and said, hey, great six-figure salary. The golden handcuffs can be real, right? But I'm going to make this jump. How did you make the decision?
Well, I first left clinical practice and was on working on the tech side of oncology. So
Mhm.
I actually was in a more lucrative type of role after I left clinical practice, and I was starting to build the business on the side. And I knew nothing about business when I started. I didn't know if I could create a sustainable business that would actually employ me in the future. I was more just following my curiosity and following what people were asking me for. And then as I got a couple of years under my belt and I realized, okay, this could be viable. What does this look like? I actually moved into a part-time position, so tried to free up a little bit more time. I was working 4 days a week and did that for a little over a year. And then I actually got laid off. So that was the impetus of pushing me out of the nest, if you will. And I remember the day I got laid off, I called a coach I was working with at the time, and
Mhm.
her immediate response was, "Congratulations!" And I'm like, "That's not a response most people get when you get laid off." But she knew that I was building this business with the goal of like getting to that, and so it was kind of the nudge I needed of just to see if this thing would
Mhm.
actually support me. But I think to your point that you mentioned with Jimmy about stepping out of clinical practice and being further away from your topic of expertise. When I designed my business, I had that foresight ahead of time because I can't be an expert in everything in oncology in any stretch of the imagination. Even if I'm in clinical practice, I can't know everything about all cancers. So I structured my business of I hire other experts to support my content. So even though I stepped out of clinical practice, I'm not directly tied to that because I do hire a lot of other people to support the content.
Yeah, and I think you and Jimmy Kelley have done a really cool job of this, where you're bringing in what I see is almost like a community of creators, content experts, right? That are expanding the reach and contribution of what you're able to do. There's only so many hours in the day that Jimmy and Kelley can create content, right? But you're also bringing in other experts, other viewpoints that could potentially allow the business to scale and grow beyond the time that you have available in the day to do that. So I like that model on both ends. Natalie, what about for you? And if you could share not only how you made that decision, but also some of your origins of having a partner and some of those decisions early on in the business, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah. So for me, I feel like maybe I made the most drastic move to quit my job and start the company. And I think our team was, influenced by, some of the mentors we had, the environment we were in. We were surrounded by other people, you know, kind of betting on themselves and taking the risk to start startups. That was the environment I was in. Um, and then we got a lot of advice about you can't build a great business by, sort of being 50% in, 50% out. That was the type of advice we got. So that's why my co-founder and I, when we were thinking about starting the company, it was more like, okay, do we want to do it? Do we want to go all in, or let's not do it? Is sort of where we were at. And, we made the decision that this is worth taking a risk. And that's how we started the company.
Natalie, since you're the only one on the call outside of myself that has a partner, you mentioned a co-founder. Talk a little bit more about that decision to work alongside someone else in growing the business versus going at it yourself. How did you arrive at that being the best decision for where you wanted the business to grow and evolve to?
I think for us, it was organic in a way. We had aligned mission and vision of the company, what we wanted to achieve. And then I think the other thing is just complementary skill sets. So, I bring sort of that clinical experience as a pharmacist, or as someone who has, worked at health system, looking at a lot of how the financial dynamics work. I understand the business perspective. My co-founder studied computer science and had experience applying AI to healthcare products. So then she brought the technical skill sets. So really, I don't think it would have been as easy for me to build this company, had I not had my co-founder from the beginning.
Very good. Thank you. And I want to hear from all four of you on this because I know one of the things that I felt early on when starting YFP back in 2015 is I would listen to entrepreneurial stories. How I Built This podcast is one of my favorites. And I would hear these stories and one point of view, it was very inspiring. And in another point of view, it was like, oh my gosh, like this is so overwhelming, right? I have an idea. I haven't taken the first step. And you're talking and listening to someone who's maybe 5, 7, 10 years down the road. And the farther you get from starting, the more you forget what it was like to be in that first 3 to 6 months. And knowing that we likely have a lot of people on the call that are maybe in the curiosity idea phase, they're going to look at Natalie's site, Brooke's site, Kelley's site, Jimmy's site, or hear about what they're doing, and they'll be like, wow, that's great. But like, how did they actually just go? How did they begin? How did they go from idea to that first step? And what did that look like? And where did that confidence come that they were willing to take a risk, even if they were working full time still at the time, but they were really willing to say, I'm going to move this beyond just the idea phase and actually put this out to the world and see what they think. So, can each of you talk about that beginning phase and what it was for you that led you from moving beyond just the idea to taking the first step? Was it an idea that you couldn't let go? Was it someone out in the market telling you like, hey, we really need this? What was it that really motivated you to get started and to begin? Jimmy, let's start with you.
Thanks, Tim. I think for me, and I can just focus on the conference. Uh, I remember back every conference we would go to, like mid-years and different components. They would have a few hour sessions, but it was nothing really geared specifically for emergency medicine pharmacists. And I would always just feel like, hey, I wish there was just a lot more out there. And I remember speaking with a pharmacist that was a mentor, and I said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had something we can go to? And it's like, yeah, we just don't have the time. And I was like, what if someone did the legwork and got it? And would you go? And I said, absolutely. And with that, I was fortunate to have an audience with the podcast, and that was something I just did because I enjoyed to and be able to have an audience to give me feedback. And the first thing I wanted to do was like, well, I can't do it all, but what happens if I just buy the website name, the domain name? And I was like, okay, I'm gonna buy one. And then we changed it a few different times. But I had a website that I can actually put stuff on. And the more I got into it and the more I spoke with other individuals, it really just drove me to figure out how to get to this next step and figure out who can help me. I think that was the biggest component, going from the idea and making an initial investment in just the website, and then figuring out, hey, do you know someone who'd be interested in this and that can help me, who's worked on conferences before? And that was the genesis of our conference, to be able to get a group of 6 people started this conference. That we had someone come from Australia last year, and we're in our 4th year of doing it. So I think it's just the initial me doing something that I could do in that moment of excitement, of just doing it, and then getting to know more people and getting help. Those were the first 2 things I would say was the genesis of the conference for us.
Jimmy, I love that. What I hear there too is you built some early momentum and you created a scenario where you had some skin in the game, right? It may not have been a massive financial investment when you talk about something like the website, but there's enough of like, I've got something in this. Like I'm willing to move something forward, and you start to stack some momentum, which I think is so early on, incredibly important, and not getting paralyzed by what's this going to look like in 3 years, right? Because you don't know. Kelley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, something that Jimmy was saying really resonates with me too. And my strategy was audience building, starting with audience building. So you can't sell something if you don't have an audience, meaning people around you that know what you're doing and hopefully want the thing that you're selling. So Jimmy mentioned he was building his audience around emergency medicine. He had colleagues that knew people. It was the same for me. Like I started building my personal brand and kind of building an audience around oncology, and I did it on LinkedIn. And really, I was the only person posting anything about oncology pharmacy for
Hmm.
arguably many years. There's still not very many of us. And that's how my initial business idea got started. People were direct messaging me and saying, like, hey, I know you're in oncology. I'm new to oncology. I'm trying to learn. Can you point me to a YouTube video? And I just kept getting the same question over and over until finally one day a light bulb went off that said, oh, okay, there's a big gap here. I have the background to be able to fill that gap. And then I had to figure out, do I want to, and how to do it. But having an audience of people is a really important first step because there's a ton of experimentation at the beginning.
Hmm.
And, I started with a newsletter, an email newsletter that I was hand personally emailing to each person because I didn't know what an email CRM was or an email service provider. And I'm like, well, there's got to be a better way because the first 20 people got like individual emails from me. So then you just start on the learning journey of like trying to figure out like, oh, do people like this newsletter? What else would they want? And that kind of snowballs to your point, Tim, about building momentum and stacking momentum.
So you were like individually Gmails you're sending out to 20 people. I
Yep.
love that though, Kelley, because right, what that shares, and I'm sure if I thought more about it, I would have many different but similar examples where I look backwards and I was like, I had no idea that you could do that at scale, or that this tool existed, or this platform or software, whatever it might be. But the point is you don't recognize that unless you take the first step to realize it in the first place. Right. And I think that's the message I really want people to hear is that as John Acuff talked about in his book, Start is you have to just start and take the first step. It's going to be messy. You're going to fall down periodically. You're going to learn from that. And you're going to look back inevitably, like I do, and listened to the first podcast we published back in 2017. I was like, oh no, gosh, right? But you don't progress and learn until that first step happens, and it's an evolution, over time. Brooke, what about for you?
Well, you mentioned first step, and I think having a business is really a series of first steps until you figure out what staircase you actually want to go up and just continuously like trying out new things. For me, it was blogging, it was a small podcast, it was creating a social media post, trying a newsletter, building an audience on Facebook. I mean, all kinds of little things until I figured out what did I enjoy, what were people reacting to. But I think for anyone out there who's looking to go from idea to action, I think there's two key questions that you want to ask yourself, which is there a gap in the market for this? Is there a need that exists? And even if 20 people are doing the exact same thing you're doing, you probably have a unique spin on it and nobody's doing it like you would do it. So even if the answer is yes, other people are doing it, what is that gap that still exists, even though other competitors exist? And the second question you want to ask yourself is this something I would have bought? Is this something I would have needed back in the day? Because there's going to be more people like you who are looking for this product or service. So answering those two questions really helped me move from idea to action.
I love the specificity of that. Thank you, Brooke. Natalie, what about for you?
I think similarly to a lot of clinician entrepreneurs, I think my business was, started by the challenges that I was just experiencing as a pharmacist, implementing a lot of, medication management solutions at a health system across different service lines. So after implementation, I started to think, asking clinicians to do more work is not exactly a viable solution. Like it's not a sustainable solution because there's such a lack of capacity. And I think the other thing for me is I was actually studying computer science while I was working at the health system. So that's how I just started to connect the dots between, oh, there's like pretty great technology out there. Like, how can that be utilized in healthcare broadly? So that's kind of some of the initial thoughts I had. It's not a product that we ended up building, but that I think that kind of made me wonder whether, there was something there, like a product to be made. But then to Brooke's point, to really validate this hypothesis of, is there a demand? Is there a gap out there? Because at the end of the day, I'm just one person. So just because I see the problem, that doesn't mean, there is kind of like a demand in the market and willingness to pay for it. So what we did before we started the company is we actually spoke to 300 people, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, patients from, health systems, health plans, pharmacies, pharma, to try to validate this hypothesis we had. And that is, what gave us kind of that confidence and signal to say, okay, I still don't really know what that is. I don't know what exactly the solution is, but at least the problem is there. And that's kind of what, gave us that push to start the company.
So much to build on there. And if we zoom out for a moment and think about a business, whether it's a service-based business, a product-based business, more specifically, as we think about service-based businesses here, I think about the perfect intersection of a business is you're solving a problem that people are willing to pay for, and that is something that you're very curious and passionate about. When those three things intersect, I think there's a lot of momentum behind an idea. Where we can get stuck is when one of those things isn't true, right? I am really curious and passionate about this, but the market's not willing to pay for it. That's a hobby, right? And that's okay, but that's a hobby. Or, maybe I have something that could be very, very profitable, but I'm not passionate about that. Good problem to have, but that could present, other challenges along the way as well. And so when we think about building something, if we're able to validate, Natalie, as you were talking about, able to validate through market research and other things that we're solving a problem and people are willing to pay for it, we then have this challenge of how do we make sure people are aware of this? Kelley, you talked a little bit about this in terms of building an audience. And I think this is where people can get stuck in today's day and age with a myriad of tools and approaches. And if I go online and see what Kelley's doing, like, or what Jimmy or Brooke or Natalie are doing, like, I don't know where to just start. Is it, do I start on LinkedIn? Do I start with a newsletter? Do I start with a podcast? Do I start with a YouTube channel? How do I bring this idea out to the world to grow awareness, to build a personal brand? So what advice would you have for folks when it comes to this concept of building an audience and determining what is the platform, what is the strategy of how you're going to connect your idea with the potential consumer that's out there. Kelley, I'll start with you just because you talked about specifically LinkedIn and some other strategies that worked well for you.
The tough question. It is. I think that you have to think through what kind of platforms are going to be most effective at discovery versus nurturing. So for example, podcasting is I think a pretty clear example of this. I don't have a podcast. We have a couple podcasters on here so they can chime in. But in general, podcasts are not good for discovery. They're good for nurturing. When somebody already knows, when somebody's wondering, like, oh, I hear this Tim Albert guy is smart. I wonder what he's doing. They're going then to listen to the YFP and like, oh, okay, he actually does know what he's talking about. But if you've never heard of Tim, you're probably not going to discover the podcast in an organic way. So social media is usually a good place for that. And which social platform you pick is highly variable, depends on who you're targeting, who your audience is, where your audience lives. I just happened to pick LinkedIn because I personally liked it. It was different than other social media. I didn't really understand it at the beginning. It took me a while to figure out like what is LinkedIn all about. But I knew my people were on there, although not all pharmacists are on there. I still run into tons of pharmacists that are not on LinkedIn. So it doesn't have to be, your total addressable market on one platform, but there has to be enough of the people there that you're going to get some feedback, you're going to get some traction, you're going to get some direct messages. So, there's a lot of different platforms out there. Maybe your personality is a better fit for something like TikTok or YouTube Shorts or Instagram. I think you could be in a lot of different places, but that spreads you very thin. So I would recommend kind of doubling down on one that you really like to go on. I'm not a big Facebook user. I don't like hanging out on Facebook. So I'm not going to create content on Facebook because that's going to make me in a position where like my people are there and I don't want to hang out there.
That's great. Let me open up to the rest of the panel. Any other thoughts on approaches for building an audience and how to be able to stay focused without trying to spread yourself in too many different areas and not necessarily doing any of them very, very well?
I think just one other thing I would add is I think Kelley's right. I think you have to do some market research to know who is my audience and where are they at. And obviously you got to go to those channels. And then the way I like to think about it is like bringing value to my audience, because people will not be searching your content, consuming your content unless you are bringing value to them. So I would think about, how do I bring value to them? I think the other difficult thing that I find is like, how do I consistently bring value? I think can be hard. Like there can be a lot that I can talk about maybe for a couple months, but after that, what is that? So I think that's just something to think about.
That's really good, Natalie, right? How do you maintain the stamina, the consistency of the content? And then the second piece I would add to that, building on Kelley's discussion of LinkedIn as a platform for her, which I too like LinkedIn and some other social channels, but have found that to be very impactful in the work that we're doing. But I would encourage people, as you're thinking about a social strategy, that how do you ultimately convert that social following to something that you have more control over and ownership of the traffic, right? So we've all heard about social algorithms. Those can change. They will change. Your likes, your comments may go up, down over time, your followers. But, if you have an email list, is kind of where people typically go, although this could look differently. If you have an email list, that's a platform that I can have a conversation with those folks whenever I want. Now, they may delete my emails, unsubscribe them, not read them, right? But it's not subject to the same type of algorithms that we're used to in some of the social channels. So I think early on, that was advice that I got that was very influential from day one. Somebody told me, start thinking about building an email list. This was back in 2015. And I remember going through I think it was a YouTube series or a course that somebody was teaching. And they said, hey, just focus on the first 100 email subscribers. Like, don't think anything beyond that. So I literally got out my phone, I think maybe some Facebook Messenger back in the day as well. And I started texting family, friends, whoever, said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a personal finance blog talking about X, Y, and Z. Are you interested? And maybe it was social pressure. Maybe they felt bad. I'm not sure. But it was a lot of yes, yes, yes. And that was some of that early momentum we were talking about. But also, like, that was the first 100, right? And then you start writing to the first 100, or you start writing 20 individual emails, whatever it is. And then you continue to build and evolve from there. So I think building an audience and thinking about how you can ultimately control that traffic to some degree is so important. Jimmy, I'm curious for you, knowing that you have a heavy presence in a social atmosphere. Obviously, you've got the podcast, multiple podcasts, I think now, and channels. Why did you decide podcasting was so important for you, and how you narrowed into that as a strategy of focus?
So went about it in the opposite direction. I had a podcast before I had a business. I just did the podcast because I was very intrigued with it. And my RPD was like, you're crazy, but other people should know that you're crazy. And the way that you can talk about literature and the way that you can be excited about this, other people need to be engaged with. So I did podcasting and a blog for free, didn't know anything about business for about 2 years prior to actually thinking to myself, hey, I have 500 people
Mm.
uh, as emails, and I'm just sending them, my pharmacy pearl and sending them the podcast. And then I realized later on, and I had some great mentors and people who really said, hey, Jimmy, you should think about solving other problems. And I went about it in such a way where I gave so much value for years. And one of the things that really, I would say, was a barrier for me was thinking to myself, I can't charge for anything. I've been giving it away for free for so long. I don't know how I can do this. And once I started to do it, it quickly became not a problem. But I went about it in the opposite way. And I think just being engaged with Twitter was my audience. So being engaged with Twitter, posting some clips on there, and the audience really told me, hey, what if you did this? What if you did the conference? What if you did these different things? And that was the area for me. So I was very fortunate to have an audience before I had a product and to do it for years. And I think looking back, I was like, well, I wish I would have thought of it and went about it in that way. But it really was just a fortunate opportunity for me to build an audience and just give free value for years and then figure out how to solve some of their problems.
So that approach, Jimmy, I think is really interesting, of providing value, right, in a way that you're going to build trust, grow your audience, and then, if it evolves in the way that it does, there's an opportunity to be able to charge. I do think a lot of people struggle with that transition exactly for the reason that you mentioned. There's a lot of head trash around pricing, charging, feeling comfortable with it. And I'm just going to say it. Pharmacists are inherently cheap, and pharmacy entrepreneurs inherently undercharge for what they're doing. And the reason that is, I'm generalizing a lot here, but the reason that is because we tend to project how we sell with how we buy. And we need to think about what is the value of what we're providing to that individual. And I think it's natural in many business cases that we start at a price and then we increase over time as we feel more comfortable and confident. But that can be a challenge. And I'd like to hear from each one of you when you think about pricing your services. How have you thought about that? Is it something that you have struggled with? And I would assume they've increased over time, but is that a fair assumption? And as you look back on how you started your pricing, would you change anything as you look backwards? Brooke, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I can start here. I think this is a really great question. I think if you ask me tomorrow, it might have a different answer. I feel like sometimes it's a moving target. And as pharmacists, like you said, we've just been providing tremendous value and helping people for so little or no cost for so long. This can be really tricky to navigate. I think some of the best advice and thoughts that I received early on about pricing is that the question should not be, what would people pay for this? But the question should be, have you sold yourself on your offer? You need to sell yourself on your offer first. You need to think about, why is this the most valuable thing that I'm offering? And these are the 20 to 30 reasons why. And the reason why this is so important is that you need to understand exactly what kind of value you're providing, what the person is going to get out of it, the outcome they're going to expect, and how this is going to change their life. And then when you get on a consult with somebody and you explain all of those things and your pricing, you've sold yourself on this offer and the price that you feel good about, you're going to come across so much more authentically. If the price is too high, it's just not going to seem genuine on the sales call. And if the price is too low, there's going to be this resentment energy that if it's not there on the sales call, it's going to be there when you deliver the product or service. So I have done really well with just every time I think about increasing my price, I have to sell myself on it first. Like, why is this so valuable? And making myself list out all of the reasons why. It always gets me to a really good place that I feel good about saying the words out loud and offering this to another individual.
I think I'll add a couple practical things too. When I first started, I mean, I started with like a low cost mini course, but when I started my main training program, I looked out to the market to see, like, nobody was doing what I'm doing in oncology, but I looked out to other educational offerings and tried to find something that was kind of set up in a similar way. And I think maybe there was an ASHP program. I can't remember. Um, but it was like maybe one of their early leadership programs. And it wasn't quite the same structure, but it was like a $7,000 program or something. So that gave me like a lot of confidence to say, like, okay, all right, this is a long program. Like mine's not quite the same, but how do I do this? And then I started with kind of a pilot program that I priced at 2,500 initially. And it was kind of the first like big program that I sold. And I got 8 people to kind of join me building the plane while we were flying it. Like I told them, I don't have this thing built. You're getting a lower price. You're getting lifetime access because I want your feedback as we go. And as I think about it now that I'm going into my 5th year of running this program, which is like crazy. I was just counting on my fingers before the call. I'm like, oh my God, I'm starting January of 25. It's going to be my 5th year. I've realized that to the value point, like it's easy to say, I think, yes, we want to price on value, but what does that actually mean? Like, can you think of a practical example? So when I think about if people don't go through my training, how else are they going to get trained? Like, really, the main thing would be residency training. So if they're going to do 2 years of residency, that's essentially $100,000 commitment, right? Like, give or take, because you're not making the same salary. And so my $4,000 program is a steal compared to a $100,000 residency investment. So that actually makes, I've chatted a lot about, I haven't raised my price since after the initial beta launch. And so that's something I'm working on now is like, what should my prices be raised to now?
Any other thoughts, Jimmy, Natalie, on pricing of services?
Yeah, I think for me, I went about it in a different approach, and we've been pushing value and value. And I went from my initial just educational courses to initially going to board certification prep. So I had a comparator. So I knew what the market was charging for that. And then I asked people, how much would you pay if you failed the exam, but you can go back 3 months? And I asked people that question, like, if you failed it, but you can go back and just redo it all, how much would that be worth to you? And people gave me these astronomical prices, and I was like, okay, I feel very comfortable with what I would charge. I say, would it be a deal for you if I charged $300 for it? They're like, absolutely. So I think going from having a product that was much more of a open course to you can just go and learn on your own to much more targeted to an actual problem. I think the first solution I provided wasn't necessarily a solution to a lot of people. I think when I realized that, I was able to provide a solution that had value, and with value is going to be that component of we're exchanging something. And for me, I was able to exchange a lot, over 1,000 questions, the largest question bank in my audience. And the timing of it was initially when the board certification for emergency medicine came out. And I wanted to make sure I provided a ton of value there. And I took a lot of time to make it. But I think initially understanding the market, testing the market, surveying people, and asking important questions that really helped me design the program and to base my prices off of that.
I think my case is maybe interesting because we sell to businesses, which has a different procurement process than, selling to consumers. So I think that's why our approach maybe tends to be, structure like based on spreadsheets. Let's see an ROI calculation, and because my customer is going to have to get it approved by other folks on their team, so they need to be able to quantify the value, which sometimes can be difficult. To Kelley's point, like, what is the value? How do you quantify that? So that's how we've been approaching pricing.
And Kelley and Jimmy, are both of your products all direct purchase on the website, or are you doing any individual types of sales calls?
I don't really do sales calls.
Okay, that's what I thought. Jimmy, same for you, right? Brooke,
Correct.
you're meeting with people one-on-one. Okay, I want to just stay here for a minute. Brooke and Natalie, if you could comment, because I think these are not one better than the other. Depends on the product, depends on the price point, depends on what you're trying to accomplish, but two very different models of products that you could just directly go onto a website and purchase. There's no sales process involved. And then obviously an opportunity here where maybe it's a higher price, or for whatever reason, we need to have a conversation that would qualify a lead or take them through that process. So Brooke and Natalie, if you could comment a little bit on the evolution and implementation of the processes that you have. I think often people start with I'm going to wing it, and then quickly realize like I've got to have a system, I've got to have a process. So whether it's Natalie when you're selling to businesses, or Brooks you're selling to individuals, how has that sales process evolved for you, and where did you learn more about that skill? Because I think it's one that we're just not very comfortable with inherently as pharmacists. Brooke, if you want to start.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I do usually a 30-minute consult call with anyone who's interested, and that could be an individual who's interested in individual coaching, group coaching, or sometimes like Natalie, it's a college of pharmacy or a pharmacy that wants to hire me for speaking engagement or a workshop. So I like to do the consult calls because I really want to get a feel for what the person is looking for. It gives me a chance to explain what coaching is and what coaching isn't, and how transformational it can be depending on exactly what they're looking for. It helps me discern, are they looking for a mentor? Are they looking for a therapist? Are they looking for a coach? It allows me to explain all of that to the individual and offer that referral if it's really not coaching, which I think is important. I think it's incredibly vulnerable to reach out and ask for help and actually get on a consult call with someone. So I like to provide that really safe, non-judgmental space for people to just share what they're looking for. And then whether it's something I can provide or somebody else, I feel like that's a value add that I'm offering my profession for someone who is in need and probably feels really alone in whatever they're feeling. So I'm enjoying the consult calls at this time. There's some coaching influencers that I follow, and they use different words like consult calls, sales calls, discovery calls. I like consult calls because it tells the individual we're going to be talking about price on this call. Discovery call feels a little vague to me, but I think it's just personal preference. So that's really just been the evolution. It's been working so far for me.
And Natalie, as I understand it, you're running your partners on more of the tech development side. You're leading all marketing, sales, business development. So I would imagine this is a big part of your work. How have you thought about and evolved your sales process?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, I think I was just talking to anyone and everyone. And I think we also had to understand, the ideal customer profile, I feel like is the term that we sometimes like to use. I think we had to understand who that was, because initially we didn't have a good idea of, what that was. And then that, I think you get to understand that better just by who's buying your product. And then that tells you a little bit about who that is. And then now I'm thinking, okay, I think these are the folks. So then where can I find more people like this, more organizations like this? And one of the things we do is attending conferences. So we, work a lot with specialty pharmacies. So now I'm going to go to specialty pharmacy conference. I'm not, going to be going to other types of pharmacy conferences, because that's the target we're looking for. And then, there's other things you can do to like optimize your SEO, like website SEO, to match kind of the words that they would be typing in to find solutions like yours. So then I think more conversations you have with customers, you ask like, oh, how did you hear about us? How did you learn about us? And then I think you try to optimize those channels.
Natalie, I want to stay on this for a second because you got me thinking about when you said SEO and optimizing, the importance of optimizing and building an audience and how these things intersect. So you and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, Natalie is at the intersection of AI and pharmacy and AI and healthcare. Like that to me is like word association, right? People should start thinking about, if they're thinking about AI and pharmacy, like you got to talk to Natalie, right? Oncology and pharmacy, Kelley, acute care and pharmacy, Jimmy. I think these are so important associations, whether it's actual SEO, search engine optimization strategies that we're employing. But this is where I think some of the personal brand and development comes in, of how are we aligning those strategies with the ideal customer that we have in mind, and then being able to reach them as we grow and build those audiences along the way as well. So I think those associations don't happen by accident. Many, many, many hours that these folks have put in, where people recognize the expertise that they have from writing, from podcasting, from speaking. Brooke, you talked about speaking at colleges and organizations. I mean, how many of those talks have you given where, it's 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 people, one after another, after another, after another, that can lead to more opportunities that continue to expand the reach and awareness of the work that you're doing. So great stuff there. I want to pivot a moment and bring a question out to the whole group that came into us as panelists, because I think it's a really good question to talk about, which is, did anyone have an extra training besides pharmacy education and residency? I know Natalie did extra training getting an MS in computer science. If not, what resources did you use to learn to upscale the business? And if I could expand this a little bit beyond just some of the formal training and certifications, and if you have those, certainly mention those as well. But have there been any resources specifically that you have found so helpful in this DIY journey of learning to be an entrepreneur? So, Jimmy, let's start with you.
Yeah, I actually, again, Kelly's one of the people who I reached out to a few years back and said, "Hey, I see what you're doing out there. I just want to chat, just to see, because sometimes you can have a conversation." And I realized she would throw certain buzzwords out, and I was like, I don't have my CRM set up yet. I should probably research what that is. Or, oh, you're doing XYZ. And you have to go and you research these things just off of simple conversations and high ticket versus low ticket. And once you start to go and read some of the books, I have literally probably 100 business books in my library right now, just based off of having a conversation with someone, understanding what's going on, getting coaching, and being able to figure out where your weak spots were, and just going and find the information out. Again, Natalie probably can speak to it to this, because you can probably ask AI now about certain things and get some information back. But there's so many tools out there. But for me personally, it was talking to people. I'm a podcaster, so I think talking to people is my gift and what I really learned the best by. And then going back and researching and using all the resources available to us. So that was really how I got an understanding of this. And Tim, we've had some conversations that where I'm like, hey, this is where I am now. And just hearing where someone else's journey helped me be able to learn from that and to try to objectively decide what my future was going to be.
Yeah, I think the good news is that there's a lot of information out there for you to learn. And I think the bad news is that there's a lot of information out there for you to learn. So I think, to Jimmy's point, like finding people who are a couple of steps ahead of you and talking to them, what resource was most helpful to you? What training do you suggest that I use? Who should I be talking to next? Those are going to be key for you. So just echoing what Jimmy said.
I think at the beginning too of your journey, I did a lot of reading, a lot of listening to podcasts at the beginning, because I just felt like, yeah, there was just a mountain of information I didn't know. But as I started to get some information under my belt, that's when I recognized, like, oh yeah, people are going to fast track you a lot faster than anything else. Sure, there's tons of information, but I mean, that's kind of the main value proposition of my training program, is all of the information about oncology drugs is available for everybody for free online. Information is not the problem. It's how do you apply that information? How do you use it in your own specific situation? So I mentioned in the chat that I do that by hiring a lot of coaches, but I also really leverage communities. I've been in several communities over the past many years of other business owners, and I learn from them every day.
Yeah, I would echo everything that you guys have said. I listen to lots of sales podcasts, read lots of sales books, talked to a lot of people who have been doing enterprise sales and marketing. But I do think what I learned is that it makes sense to talk to people who are in a similar position as you, or like a little bit ahead, because what I found is I was talking to really experienced enterprise salespeople, but they worked at big corporates. So then you're at a very, very different place, and some of their advice just doesn't translate, because either you don't have the resources to execute what they have done, or you don't have the product validation that they had when they were selling their product. So then I love talking to, fellow entrepreneurs who are kind of in a similar space. And then I think sharing that knowledge has been very impactful.
Yeah, and Brooke, I loved what you shared too, right? I think about the availability of information so much, which is a gift and also can be very overwhelming, right? And I think that's where some of the networking can be very helpful. I think read several books because Kelley has mentioned it, or I heard somebody else mention it, and finding those resources that really connect with you, and sometimes that can become a distraction too, to actually building the thing that you're trying to work on. So there's a balance between learning and doing along the way as well. let me transition as we wrap up to turn the conversation inward a little bit. I think entrepreneurship has taught me the most about myself and has exposed every limitation I wasn't aware of that I had. And I really do think that when I'll look back on this journey, yes, it was fun building. Sure, there's a lot of financial upside. All of that is good. But I really think some of the inner transformation and the work and just what it forces you to really look inside and challenge yourself and to see yourself in a different way is really the greatest gift that I have experienced along this journey. And so my final question to each of you is, as you look back on your journey, what is something that you have learned about yourself along the way that perhaps you weren't expecting when you began this? Jimmy, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I realized initially that I was not very good with giving instructions and understanding how important that is to working with other people because doing the work is very important, but designing the work is for me even more valuable and understanding how resilient I could be was very important because again, you don't get in business and last a year without being very resilient and understanding that there are so many challenges that came up and being able to tackle all of those was phenomenal. And it makes me feel good because you can accomplish anything if you just stay persistent and resilient through the process and understand how you have to adapt to the current challenges that you have. And for me, the number one thing I think about, especially with working with other individuals, is understanding the importance of being able to adapt yourself and being able to really give great instructions because if you don't, it will get wrong much more likely than if you give great instructions to begin with.
Kelley, how about for you?
Yeah, one thing I've learned about myself that so I've always been very motivated and ambitious person. Have had workaholic tendencies my entire career, even before pharmacy. Even as young as 18, I used to have three different jobs. I don't remember when I slept at all, but you're 18, so you don't need to sleep then. But what I've learned is that I'm very good at consistency. So to the point earlier about like consistent content production, I've actually finally feel like I've nailed that. I post 5 days a week on LinkedIn, have been doing that for almost 2 years now. And so I constantly have to create a lot of content. And that is great for a lot of things, but everything is a double-edged sword, right? So the flip side of that is consistency can be a challenge when I need to pivot or change
Hmm.
quickly is that I'm so used. Like people have told me, like, hey, you could cut back a little bit on your content production. You don't have to publish that much. And I feel like, no, like I've been doing it 5 days a week for almost 2 years. It's like a badge of honor. I'm like, I don't know if I can do that. So that it's like a hindrance to me to be able to pivot quickly. And in entrepreneurship, you have to be able to pivot.
That's really good. And I think sometimes what's right for the season now might look different in a year or two. And being open to that change and evolving can be hard, especially if we are stubborn about that along the way. I can relate to that, Kelley. Brooke, what about for you?
Yeah, so much to say about what I've learned, very similar to you, Tim, though, what you described earlier. I feel like some of my biggest learnings is that I'm in charge of my life. I'm in charge of my career. I'm being myself is the boldest thing I could ever do. I'm the greatest project I could work on, and I don't ever want to be done. I think in academia, we sometimes put ourselves into these cookie cutter roles, even more so than traditional pharmacist roles. And sometimes it feels like your career is not your own when other people have ideas for where you should go and what you should do next. So this self-discovery process has been so amazing for me, and I'm just privileged to help others through that now. Great question.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Brooke. And Natalie, what about you?
I used to think that I was immune to sort of outsiders' perceptions of me. That was my perception of myself. And then I think in entrepreneurship, there's a lot of rejections, and I think it kind of made me also experience a lot of friction with a lot of kind of different folks. Obviously, you're building a company. So I think I was just interacting with a lot more people than I was previously just working at a company. And then that made me realize, you know what? That's not true. I guess I care more about other people's opinions than I thought. And so I think that's just one thing I'm learning to navigate. more challenges and rejections will come.
Especially when you're doing sales like you are. There's no greater teacher of what the ego is and the challenges that are there than doing sales. So great stuff. I really appreciate all four of you, Jimmy, Kelley, Brooke, and Natalie. Thank you so much.